Welcome back to Knowledge is Kings, guys. I am Kings, and a customer saw a mobile storage shelving system on Tiktogram or Instatalk or some one of those non-YouTube video poser platforms, and he wanted me to build what he saw. Well, the design that he saw only worked with the exact storage bin that the maker used in his video, so I made my own version. The one he saw held the bins by the lids, which doesn't work well for very heavy laden bins, so I wouldn't like to follow that design anyway, but here's what I came up with. The bins are set on shelves instead of being supported by the lip around the bins at the top. Without further ado, let's get to it. To start, I cut all of my 2x3s down to the same size. Then all of my 2x4s. Once I bring all that over to my table, I lay them out with the same measurements, and instead of pulling a tape measure on each piece, I mark all the measurements I want once on the bench top, and then align all of my pieces to the end of the bench and mark them according to those marks. If you use a stick to make marks on a wall like this, the stick is called a story pole. So I'm going to dub this the story pole method. I could just align all the ends of the boards and use a big square to mark the lines across all of them, but my table is not wide enough to hold all of the boards, and if any of the boards are off in some way, errors can occur, and depending on how far off they are, those errors can be big. I think this is the fastest, most accurate way. Once I have all of the pieces marked, it's time to screw all the sections together. I push the pieces all down tight to the bench to keep them flush with each other, and I also make sure to keep the boards lined up with the marks I just made. After I've made 6 of those sections, I move on to making the base for the storage rack. I cut a piece of 4x4 down to size with the miter saw. I need to add casters to the base, and if you make this, I do not recommend these casters. I doubt these will last very long, but the customer provided these and wanted them used for this. So that's what I used. I made a shallow depth hole for the bolt of the caster to be pounded into, and then drilled a hole just smaller than the outside diameter of the threads of the caster bolt. I want the bolt to thread into the nut and then make its own threads into the wood for a little more holding power for these types of casters. I would recommend screw-on casters if you want to make this. After I put 2 casters on this base, I set all the pieces out on my floor. I pre-drilled the holes for the fasteners, which in this case are GRK structural screws, and had them all ready to go in each hole. Now I ended up counterboring these screws in later, as I didn't think they were long enough to hold. And by that, I mean the screws came out when I tried to tip this up later, due to the weight on the corner of the board I am screwing on now. I was thinking these screws were 4.5 inches, but they were only 4 inches. Oh well, you'll have that on these big jobs. To screw on the other piece, I needed to clamp some boards on so I could hold up the piece also using clamps. I put a clamp loosely on one side and then lifted the other one in place. I tightened this clamp right away before worrying about lining it up because I don't want it to accidentally fall from the other side that is just loosely holding it. Once it is safely held in place, I screw it all in. The top side is screwed on in the same way, but without casters, which hopefully I didn't need to tell you. Once I had it all screwed together, I cut all the plywood pieces to their final sizes, and here I have the top screwed on already and one side of the bottom. The side that I have screwed on is flush on both sides. It is not flush on the other side, so I'll show you how to fix that. As the pieces of plywood are straight and square and all the lumber was cut to the exact same length, if it is flush on one side, it should be flush on the other side for the rack to be straight and square. I used a couple of pipe clamps to move everything flush. Then screwed it all together, adding a couple more clamps to make sure the sides were tight against the plywood as well. I had already done this same procedure on the top. When everything was square and straight, I screwed in the rest of the plywood. Now I have double supports for the plywood at each upright, even though one would be enough to hold the weight of the full bins. This is because having two like this helps resist racking against lateral forces, such as trying to push this when it's fully loaded across the garage. With all the screws in, this project is complete. Now it's time to test fit some buckets. The customer only gave me a few buckets to use for measuring and fitting, so I can't fill it up entirely. Also, I will say these are the toughest, beefiest storage bins I've ever seen. The lid even has metal hold downs. These are not your typical junky bins. I'll put a link to these exact bins in the description. Now this storage shelving is very heavy due to all the 4x4s and 3/4 inch plywood, and I have a plan available for this on my website, link in the description, to build it as I have it here. But you could use 2x3s for the uprights with one 2x3 plywood support piece in the middle of each, and use 1/2 inch plywood instead of 3/4, and 2x4s for the bottom instead of 4x4s, with a couple more casters on the bottom to bring the weight down. But only if what will be loaded into the bins will be relatively light. And I would recommend putting a diagonal brace along one of the long sides to help resist racking. This one is heavy and rather expensive, I think between $600 and $700, but it is very rigid, and it fits a bin size that is 16 tall, 16 wide, and 33 inches long. That's all I have for this project. Be sure to leave a like as it really helps out the channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. So it didn't take long after getting into the garage and putting bins on it and rolling around that one of the casters ended up bending, which wasn't really a surprise. So the customer ordered some new ones, which I then installed for him, and I think these will be a lot better and last a really long time. Okay, now the video's done.
Oh, I like that.